publications span different subfields of scientific inquiry. She's a world-leading authority on bilingualism over their lifespan and is particularly well known for her studies of exceptionally talented near-native adult second language speakers. For her research on the changes, attrition that take place in the native language of advanced second language speakers. She's also internationally known for her contribution to language typology, especially for her research on constrained variation at the lexicon syntax interface, which she has investigated in many languages, and her studies of gradients in natural language. She's the founding director of the Information and Consultancy Center Bilingualism Matters and was awarded a Beltane Fellowship for Public Engagement. We're delighted to have Antonella joining us from Edinburgh today. Okay, so great. Over to you, Antonella.
Hello, just sharing. Yes, can you hear me? Can you see me? Yes?
Yes, we can. Great, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with you today, although I would prefer to be with you in person, but it's also very nice to be there online. I would like to start just by defining what we mean by bilingualism or multilingualism, because many people think that a bilingual can only be a person who knows two languages perfectly from birth. And this is not the way we use the term bilingual. For us, a bilingual is a person who knows two or even more languages and uses them on a regular basis. So whether the two languages were learned as a young child or whether they were learned in childhood, but one language first and then another, or whether they were learned as an adult, so adult second language learning, both young adults and older adults. For us, all of these people are bilingual, meaning they have more than one language. This is important, and I'll come back to this during my presentation. Now, the other thing, a very general context to what I'm going to say, is the challenge for multilingualism in the world. We have an English dominant world, in the sense that obviously there are countries where English is the national language. There are countries where English is the official language, but not the majority language. But it's quite clear that English is the language, the most prestigious language that everybody wants their children to learn. So some figures, of 7 billion people living in the world, 1.5 billion speak English. So that's 20% of the Earth population. 360 million people speak English as their first language. You won't be surprised to hear that English is by far the most commonly studied foreign language in the world, followed by French. I mean, Spanish obviously is also very prominent and very important, but English is really the dominant language. And that poses a number of problems. For example, in the country where I live, the United Kingdom, I would say that it creates an environment that I would call privileged monolingualism, in the sense that we know that the UK has the worst language skills of all the countries in the EU, or I should say had the worst, given that the UK is about to leave the EU for good. And that poses a huge tax for the economy of the UK. It's been calculated in terms of about £48 billion a year. And we're having Brexit that I've already mentioned, and that makes things even worse because it's putting up more language barriers because people are not motivated to learn languages because of the status of English. They think, why should we invest in languages? Why should we learn other languages? Everybody speaks English, right? So that's a big problem. And the other problem that I'm going to come back to is the status of what I would call minority languages. Minority languages can be of two types. One is regional, indigenous minority languages that are only spoken in certain places, but also languages introduced by migration. I mean, migration is a reality in many, many different countries. So families emigrate to a different country and they bring their languages, their cultures with them. So of the, you know, the exact figure is not known, but, you know, approximately between 5,000 and 7,000 languages spoken in the world. The vast majority of languages are minority languages in every single country in which they are spoken. So this again, you know, poses an interesting question, and I'll come back to this. A question about the survival of many of these languages. So I'm going to show you that having more than one language is better than having just one. And I'm aware that in many respects, I may be preaching to the converted in the sense that you're already convinced that speaking more than one language may be better than just one. But I think it's not a waste of time actually to look at what it means to say that knowing more than one language is more than one is better than just one. And as we move on, I would like to say that we need to separate myths from facts. As we'll see, there are still many misconceptions about what it means to be bilingual or multilingual. Bilingual, remember, in a broad sense, as I explained before. And so we have to distinguish between myths and misconceptions and facts, if you want, what is coming out of research, for example. But increasingly, and we'll see why, we need to separate science, so, you know, what is actually based on research, from science fiction. So we have an increasing number of misunderstandings or misinterpretations of research. So what are the myths? Let's start from the myths, you know, the old-fashioned myths. And let's start from child language learning, and then I'll move on to adults. So myths about child language learning, very strong myths still. A young child, you know, is confused if you give them more than one language. So a child, you know, who hears more than one language, how are they going to learn any language properly? They're ending up, you know, not speaking any language properly because they're confused. Related to this, the fact that, hold on, that there may be problems at school. So a child, for example, who comes from a different language background, they have to learn the language of the place where they live, but they're going to have problems at school because having already one language causes problems. And then, as I said, you know, the misconception that there are useful languages and not so useful languages. So English, as we said, you know, it's number one, but Spanish is obviously considered a useful language. Chinese is increasingly considered a useful language because I won't surprise you by saying that what makes a language prestigious or useful is the degree of political and economic power that goes with certain languages. So that means that other languages are not perceived as very useful. So regional minority languages like Gaelic or Sardinian, or languages introduced by migration. What about adult language learning? What are the misconceptions? Well, a very strong misconception is that you need to be a child to learn a language well, right? I mean, you can't learn a language as an adult or learn a language well as an adult. Even if you're younger than that guy in my slide, you know, the idea is that you need to be very young to really learn a language well. And then, you know, how do you learn languages if you're an adult? You go to a class and you get a teacher who explains how the grammar works. And if you make a mistake, you get corrected. So teaching and correction, that's the only way to learn a language if you're an adult. And then, of course, if you're an adult, you already have at least one language, your native language. So that language is going to condition, affect the second language. So you're going to make mistakes that are due to transfer interference from the first language. So transfer goes in one direction only, but not in the other. So what are the effects of bilingualism? What is research actually telling us that contradicts these common myths about child bilingualism and about adult bilingualism? There is an obvious positive effect of bilingualism that I would call cultural awareness. Let's remember that behind every language there is a culture. So if you learn another language, you are likely to be bicultural or multicultural, which can only be a very good thing. You are aware of other people's cultures and how and their cultural richness and the cultural differences that can enrich society. But I'm going to talk about less obvious effects, partly because this is my area of research, and partly because these effects are less well known. So, for example, language learning changes the brain. Actually, it changes the brain from an anatomical point of view. That means that even if you learn a language well as an adult, you get more gray matter growing in your brain, in particular areas of the brain. So your brain changes from an anatomical point of view. And it changes from a connectivity point of view. So there are more connections relating certain areas of the brain. So much more connectivity as a result of learning a language, as a result of handling more than one language in the brain, even if language learning happens later in life. But okay, you can say, well, okay, it's very nice that the bilingualism changes the brain, but that's something that we can't see, right? So what we're really interested in is whether language learning and bilingualism can change the way we behave, the way we think. And these are also less obvious effects. And this is what I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes. So what does research show for children, for example? It shows that having more than one language actually makes children more aware of how language works. Not from the sense that from the point of view that they can actually recite grammatical rules. Children don't do that. They can't do that. Their brain doesn't have that kind of cognitive maturity, but they have a spontaneous, a tacit, a natural understanding of how language works. And that means they can also have a head start in early literacy, particularly in learning to read an alphabetic system like English or Spanish, but also Greek and Russian with different letters, different characters. They're still alphabetic systems. And it has been shown that having more than one language actually provides an inroad into the foundations of early literacy. Also, better ability to learn other languages. So if you know more than one language, learning a third language, a fourth language becomes easier. But also, interestingly, bilingual children can also be better at learning, at understanding the majority language. I'll come back to this, but remember the misconception, you know, a child who comes from a different language background with a different language, how can they do well in the majority language that they use at school? So research has shown that actually bilingualism can make children potentially better at the language of schooling. And then many parents worry about language mixing, you know, oh, my child is mixing. Does it mean that my child is confused? Actually, language mixing, and there's a huge amount of research on this, actually shows competence in both languages. So there are rules of language mixing, there is a grammar of language mixing. If you're wondering what that example is, that's an example from one of my sons when he was learning Italian. My sons were lucky enough to learn English and Italian, which is my native language, from birth. And that is an example of mixing, because it means, mommy, are we eating roast potatoes tonight? Mamma, mangiamo patate crunciose stasera. The point is that crunciose doesn't exist in Italian. It's taken, it's copied from English, from crunchy, but that piece of mixing is perfect from the point of view of the Italian grammar. What about adults? What does research show for adults? Well, this is one area in which Edinburgh is really specialized, because adults can reach extremely high levels of proficiency. So remember the misconception. How can they learn? How can you learn a language well if you start as an adult? Actually, they can reach native-like levels of proficiency, even if they may maintain an accent. So there are different areas. Accents are also conditioned not only by cognitive factors, but also by motor, articulatory factors. So, so maybe, you know, native-like levels are not possible in all respects, but certainly they're possible in many respects. And so there is much more plasticity in the brain, and this is what research over the last 30 years has shown. Both young and older adults, as I've shown, you know, the brain changes, the brain becomes more connected, the brain becomes more plastic. Yes, because the brain can really absorb new information in an effective way. And it has been shown that multilingualism can serve as what we can call a cognitive reserve that delays certain aspects of aging. So certain aspects of normal aging, like normal decline of certain cognitive functions like memory and attention, but also in some cases, it can delay the appearance of certain kinds of dementia. So the initial symptoms of certain kinds of dementia can be delayed by 4 or 5 years in adults who know more than one language. What does research show that applies to both children and adults? This is very, very interesting and fascinating. It shows that if you have more than one language, you are more aware of other people's perspectives. So you're able to take another person's point of view. So in that example is visual, right? If you look at that number, if you are on one side, you read it as 6. If you are on the opposite side, you read it as 9. But you have to understand that depending on your position, you can read it in different ways. And that applies to other kinds of differences that bilingual people are better aware of. And again, this is something that it's hard to underestimate in today's world, the ability to understand that it is possible to have other points of view, different points of view, and different perspectives in a variety of domains. There is a lot of research that shows that bilingualism and multilingualism make people better at paying attention. Paying selective attention. So this is a very general ability. We have to pay attention to what we're doing because otherwise we don't do it well. We can't do it well if we're constantly distracted by other factors. So paying attention in a selective way, so paying attention to what matters, at the same time ignoring or disregarding what doesn't matter is very important. And this is what multilingualism actually does. And it makes people better at handling conflicts or conflicting information. And also it gives them more flexibility in switching from one task to the other. And I can, so, you know, I'll come back, you know, why should it be the case that having more than one language makes you better in these respects? Before I get there, let me just point out that these cognitive effects have been found over the lifespan. So not just in children, not just in young adults like university students, and we've done research on that, but also in much older learners who start learning a new language in their retirement years. So after 65, 70, we studied people who start a new language after they turn 80. Their brain reacts in a positive way. They may not have the time scale to learn a language, you know, over many years, but certainly learning the language improves the way their brain works. There are new myths, as I said, you know, science fiction emerging. So, right, so bilingual children are kind of geniuses, right? I mean, if you give them more than one language, yes, they're more intelligent. No, that's not what we meant. Bilingual children have certain extra gears that give them an advantage in certain situations, but it's not a question of being more intelligent. And very common misunderstanding of the research on aging. If you're bilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's, right? Wrong, because it doesn't mean that you don't get dementia. I mean, you know, if people get dementia, they get it no matter how many languages they know, but the initial symptoms manifest themselves at a later stage. And if you have dementia, 4 or 5 years of extra independent life are very, very important indeed. Now, why these advantages? The reason, one of the main reasons seems to be that, so what matters is the fact of having more than one language in the brain. So it's a kind of mental juggling of having more than one language in the brain. So when you speak one language, you have to exclude the others. And when you speak the others, you have to exclude your own. So I'm speaking English to you, but my Italian is very much active in my brain, as well as the other languages I speak, and my brain is working to keep them out so that they don't interfere too much with my English. And this is what happens in all bilinguals. So this kind of mental gymnastics causes these advantages. And there are no more useful or less useful languages from this point of view. What matters is having more than one, not having prestigious languages, very useful languages, languages spoken by billions of people in the world, is the fact of having more than one. Do you need to be native-like in speaking to get these advantages? No. So you don't need to speak like a native. You don't need to have perfectly balanced proficiency. I'll tell you something. The perfect bilingual doesn't exist. In all bilinguals, even very proficient bilinguals, there's always a language that is either slightly ahead of the others or a great deal ahead of the others. But then if the situation changes and you get input from the other languages go ahead. So the relative balance between the languages of multilingualism changes over time, all the time, depending on current experiences. And let's remember that bilingual is not the sum of two monolinguals. So this is, again, you know, a common misconception. You have to be perfectly bilingual in order to qualify as a bilingual. No, because being bilingual doesn't mean to be a monolingual in language A plus a monolingual in language B. Although, unfortunately, many educational and diagnostic tests are still based on monolingual norms. So bilinguals are constantly compared with monolingual norms. In educational environments, for example, where many educational tests are based on how a monolingual would behave. So how many words does a typical monolingual child know at the age of 6? Well, if you give that test to a bilingual child, they're probably not going to do very well, because they know words in both languages. And so the total number of words may be larger than in monolinguals, but they're spread across 2 languages. And so they don't do well on tests based on monolingual norms. Also in diagnostic, in health environments, many of diagnostic tests for speech impairments, for example, or autism or other impairments are based on monolingual norms. And they should be adjusted to bilingual norms, taking into account the fact that bilingualism is not the sum of 2 monolinguals. Also, it has to be borne in mind that the benefits that I talked about are not automatic, in the sense that they're not always found in all bilinguals and in all language learners, because bilingualism is not a black or white dimension. It's not that you're either bilingual or you're not bilingual. You can be bilingual, more or less bilingual and multilingual along a continuum, because many other factors play a role. And now we'll focus on those factors. And many of these factors are actually experiential factors. It depends on the kind of experience that bilingual children or adults have at particular points in time. So I'll give you a general picture on current research on bilingualism, and this has important implications. And I'm now going to move to public engagement and more research in particular areas. But there are very important implications for different areas of society. For example, for families, or for teaching, language learning and teaching in schools, in primary schools, but also in secondary schools, for migrant children and multilingual, increasingly multilingual classrooms, for regional minority languages and how these languages can be preserved and maintained, and for language policy. So all of these are areas of society where people have to make decisions about bilingualism and multilingualism. So, early bilingualism, what matters? And I'll come back to this, we run a center called Bilingualism Matters that tries to bridge the gap between research and society. So we deal with the typical questions and questions that arise in different areas of society. So for families dealing with young bilingual children, what matters is enough exposure to 2 languages. We get plenty of families who say, oh, I speak a language, my partner speaks their own language, but our child is not bilingual. And then it turns out that the child spends, only half an hour a day with one of the parents, typically the parent, who speaks the minority language. And so the child is not hearing enough of both languages. So a bilingual child, in order to become fully bilingual, they have to get exposed in an engaged way. So children don't need language lessons because their brain that is not equipped to deal with language lessons, but they need to get exposed to both languages in sufficient quantities of time. Also, they need to hear both languages from more than one person. So from a variety of speakers. This is very important and very underestimated, because it's not enough to have one parent, even if you hear these parents often enough, because it's what we call normal variation. So people speaking in different ways, that gives the child an idea of what is possible and what is not possible in the language. Also, it gives them the idea that, hey, this language is used by everybody. It's not used just by mommy or daddy, it's used by lots of people. And so it's a language that you can use to say anything, exactly like in the other language. So having even a mini community around is very important. Literacy helps, so learning to read, at least to read in both languages, that helps because it makes available all kinds of sources of input, and positive attitudes. Children are very sensitive, I'll come back to this, to what people think about their languages. And so if they are aware that people don't think very highly about their being bilingual in particular languages, or they're speaking particular languages, not surprisingly, they're not very motivated to learn them or to speak them. In schools, the typical idea is that, oh, children, you know, they learn like sponges, right? So is that the way really it works? You know, is that the way language learning works in children? You just give them 1 hour of exposure in the classroom and they learn. Actually not. So younger is not necessarily better unless there is enough input in the second language. As I said before, unless the child is engaged with the language, even in a classroom environment. They find it interesting, they find it engaging, they find it funny. And again, variety of speakers. So hearing it only from the teacher for a very limited time, just 1 hour a week, is probably not enough to learn the language, even if you're young, you're a young child. Are there difficult languages for children? All languages are learnable by young children, but the children don't learn like adults. Depending on their age, they rely on different cognitive mechanisms that develop over time. And so it's important to have realistic expectations about learning outcomes in classrooms, for example. A 5-year-old doesn't learn in the same way as a 10-year-old because a lot happens in the brain from a cognitive point of view, from a development point of view, between the ages of 5 and the ages of 10. So we can't provide the same methods and expect children to learn in the same way. And we've been working with in Scotland with the Scottish government on language learning because 6 years ago they introduced a policy that they call 1+2, which means 2 languages in primary schools. Very innovative policy because before there was basically no language learning at all in Scottish schools. Remember the privileged monolingualism of this country. We've been working with the Scottish government on the implementation of this policy because teachers need to know that children learn differently at different ages. So the first language is introduced at age 5, the second language at age 10. That's a world of difference between those 2 ages. 1 hour a week is the typical time allotted. Is that enough input? And no, the short answer is no, it's not enough input, particularly for the younger children. Teachers should be properly trained on language learning, on how children learn languages at different ages. Parents should be informed and helped to support their child. If parents are on board with language learning, they can provide appropriate support and motivation for their children. Now, I'll come back to a little bit on this. Migrant families, as I said, migration is obviously very common, more and more common in all countries. And many migrant families feel under pressure to stop speaking their home language because they think, or they are told, that their language is an obstacle to their child's linguistic integration, also social integration. So their children have to learn the community language. And the idea is that if the parents keep speaking their home language, how can the child learn the community language? We know from research that maintaining the home language is not an obstacle to learning the community language. Of course, the child needs to hear enough of Spanish if they move to a Spanish-speaking country, English if they move to an English-speaking country, but not from the parents, who actually are often learning the community language themselves, and so they can't provide good input to their children. They do much better at if they continue to speak their home language, also from the point of view of family emotions, family communication. There are many challenges for migrant families that need to be faced, and I don't have time to go into this. I can come back to this in questions if you want. And regional minority languages, as I said, many of these languages are there, but they're dying. They're dying because they're not learned by children anymore, because parents don't speak them to their children, because the languages are not perceived as useful, and they are seen as interfering with the majority language. So if languages are not learned by children, they die. And that is Absolutely certain. How many generations does it take? Not very many. So we have to persuade people that it's a good idea to keep speaking their minority language, their local indigenous language. And we have to persuade them that if there is a minority language spoken in a particular area, that is a fantastic advantage. That's a resource. That's a resource that governments should invest in, because it's a source of advantages for the families that speak them, quite apart from being a source of linguistic and cultural diversity that needs to be preserved. So let's look at some research in just the last 10 minutes of my talk. Let's look at some research that we've done in our environment, but it's also been done in similar environments. So for example, Chinese in Scottish schools. So Chinese, as I said, is an emerging language. It's a language that is perceived as more and more important, useful to learn from an instrumental point of view, from the point of view of business, employment, etc. So Chinese in Scottish school is highly valued. And typically the exposure is 1 hour a week, as I said, not enough. So we did a research on primary school classes, and we wanted to know whether children learned any Chinese with 1 hour a week. The answer is yes, they learned some words. And obviously they didn't learn to become fluent, but they did learn something even in 1 hour a week. Did exposure to Chinese have any effects on English? Remember that learning another language can benefit the native language. And the answer is yes. We found some good effects on English of these children exposed to Chinese. Were there any effects on cognitive factors outside language? As I said before, some, not in all cases. In fact, we found effects only in schools that took the initiative to offer more hours and more exposure to native speakers. So the schools that stuck with 1 hour a week, possibly taught by a non-native speaker of Chinese, didn't do very well from the point of view of effects outside the language domain. But the schools that actually invested more and offered more time and more exposure from native speakers, that's when we found these positive effects outside language. Our research on multilingual classrooms, this is very interesting. This is European funded research where we wanted to see whether language learning of a new language, new for everybody, could foster the social and linguistic integration of migrant children in multilingual classrooms, in Scottish classrooms, although this research was done in other European countries as well. So the common language was Spanish. So nobody knew Spanish. There were no native speakers of Spanish in the classroom. Everybody had to learn Spanish as a new L2. And the classrooms varied according to whether they were more multilingual, so there were more migrant children, or less multilingual, so fewer multilingual children. Classrooms varied along this dimension. And in the end, after 1 year, we measured how much Spanish children had learned, both monolingual Scottish children and migrant bilingual multilingual children, and we gave cognitive tests. And what we found, to cut a long story short, is that a greater number of multilingual children passed the Spanish and the cognitive test. So clearly, the multilingual children had an advantage in learning Spanish, even if they were still learning English as the community language. So they were becoming fully bilingual, and that was already showing an advantage in learning Spanish as a new language. But also we found that, interestingly, monolingual Scottish children did better at cognitive tests in the more multilingual classrooms. So the more they were exposed to other languages, even languages that they didn't understand, the better they did from a cognitive point of view. This is something that we need to study more. So we can't say, oh, this is, the reality. We need more research. But it's a very promising result that can really inform classrooms. Common prejudices on minority languages. I'll go very quickly on this. So as we know, minority languages, there are lots of prejudices. A child who speaks Sardinian can't speak Italian well. A child who speaks Gaelic is not very good at English. And this disregards the fact that languages in contact always affect each other in both directions, as I said before. So proficient bilinguals, as we said, they're not the sum of two monolinguals. Now, I will skip some of this research. You'll get the slides so you can look at the details in your own time. But just to say, from Sardinian, which is, by the way, a language of my background, my mother was from Sardinian and she never spoke Sardinian to me because it's not a useful language. So I know what it means. So we compared monolingual Italian children with bilingual Italian Sardinian children. And we, in cognitive and Italian tasks, so the prejudice that Sardinian speaking children don't speak Italian well, and we found, we gave them cognitive and Italian tests, and we found basically that there was no difference between bilingual and monolingual children, except where there were differences, they were in favor of the bilingual children. So the notion that bilingual children are disadvantaged was really not shown by this. For Sardinian adults, we looked at different levels of education, and we found that for lower education levels, bilingualism was definitely an advantage. And bilinguals at lower education levels performed better than monolinguals because they had more than one language. For Gaelic, which is the main minority language spoken in Scotland, we found again that bilingual children in bilingual Gaelic education perform better than monolinguals in some, not all, cognitive tests. So again, where there is a difference is in favor of the bilinguals. There isn't always a difference though. And we found that new speakers of Gaelic, so students who study Gaelic in Gaelic medium education, but don't come from Gaelic speaking families, these new speakers of Gaelic do equally well as home speakers of Gaelic. So they do well. There's no difference between them, between home and new speakers, no negative attitudes, but they're not really motivated to speak Gaelic. English is more cool. So that is a problem if we want these new speakers to speak Gaelic to their children when the time comes, because they're not really motivated. So positive attitudes matter. We found this in another research project. The children who come from Gaelic speaking families in Gaelic medium education with positive attitudes do better in both language and cognitive tasks. Right, so what do we need to do? We need to, we think that by providing enough information to people who have to make decisions about their children, about their students, about their policies, about their patients, about bilingualism, they benefit from more accurate information, and that leads to better decisions. We think that language learning in schools can be enhanced by making languages real, more engaging, more exposure and more engaging exposure, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. We think that adult language learning should be encouraged at all ages. Adults can engage with the language, can succeed at all ages, even if not to the top level, and even with very different aims. So language learning should be encouraged across the lifespan. And we need to build on research, we need to evaluate outcomes, obtain evidence for what is working and what is not working. And this is what we do with my center, Bilingualism Matters, where we collaborate with many sectors of society. We get commissioned, research commissioned by different stakeholders, and we train a variety of people. We have a huge international network of 27 branches, 19 in the UK and in Europe, 5 in the US, 1 in Canada, 1 in the Middle East, and 1 in China. And we can benefit from this because we can compare different contexts for bilingualism, different ways of addressing similar issues. So we convey research to the community, for sure. That's one of our aims. We do a lot of research funded by a variety of funders. We have a number of research projects because this is what we do for a living. But also we gain from communicating research to the general public. So the effects go in both directions. So our research benefits, we get more insightful research from communication to society. We get a better understanding of the context for research questions, better research insights, and we train students, volunteers, to talk clearly to non-academics, to engage in community projects. And we know that this experience is valued by employers once students graduate. At this point, I'll stop. Sorry if I went over time. I wish to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Antonella. That was absolutely fascinating. We've had lots of comments saying so, and a good number of questions. So let's see how many we can get through. Okay, I've got them noted here. Okay, so from Joaquin, he said that you said that language learning changes the brain from a cognitive point of view. Can we say that learning an L2 might empower our executive functioning skills and therefore provide that brain with an advantage over other brains in developing 21st century skills?
Thank you very much for the question. I didn't use the term executive functions because it sounds a little bit technical, but that's precisely, you know, one of the aspects that is studied in research. Not just executive functions. The executive functions tend to get the lion's share of attention in the media and so on, but there are many other aspects of cognition that are being studied. But sure enough, executive functions refers to precisely the ability to pay attention in an effective way, and this is what I was talking about. So yes, executive functions are important in all aspects of daily life. So this is clearly a benefit that empowers, or is reflected in different aspects of our everyday life. So definitely, that's a very, very useful effect of multilingualism.
Okay,
not
great.
the only one.
Yes, great. Thank you. I love this next question. As a Spanish speaker with a shocking British accent still, this is from Alan. So Alan's asking, so some learners of other languages try to imitate accents, posh for example, which are associated with a certain status in order to assume a different identity and appear to have mastered that language better. What is your opinion of this? Is it not better to learn a language and maintain your own identity, preserving a degree of your own accent in the target language?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that there is huge variation from learner to learner. So adults don't learn in the same ways. And so there are people who are actually very good at learning accents and less good at learning grammar. And there are people who are very good at learning grammar and less good at learning accents. And you find the whole spectrum of variation. Now, there are also, your connection between accents and identity is spot on. It's really very, very important. But that means that there are people who could produce a native-like or a close to native-like accent, but they don't feel comfortable with that because they feel like actors. They feel that, speaking with a native accent in a language that is not your own it's just not you. And we've come across people like this. On the other hand, there are people who really try, to learn and, to acquire a better accent with not much success. Does it matter? I mean, obviously, if people have a very good accent, they are perceived to be better at the second language. That is what, people immediately judge but that doesn't mean that they are better, in all respects. So I think, there are pros and cons. And as I said, learning accents doesn't depend only on the brain. It really depends on retraining your articulatory organs in particular ways. So it's a combination of physical and cognitive in a way that learning grammar isn't.
Sure. Yeah, great. Thank you for that. This is a really interesting question as well. So from Danielle, I'm not sure if it is a myth, but I've heard that bilingual people tend to have less vocabulary in both languages they have learned. How real is that?
It's certainly true that bilingual children who grow up with two languages, initially and for a while, they have, as I said before, a vocabulary that is spread across languages. So typically they know fewer words in each language, partly because they learn these words in different contexts. So if the two languages are learned in different contexts, certain words are learned in one language and the other words are learned in the other language. That doesn't mean that the total number of the total vocabulary is smaller than in monolinguals. In many cases, it can be wider, but it's spread across different languages. And so people who test, as I said, bilingual children should be aware of this. Now, for bilingual adults, it depends on what they're doing. I mean, clearly, it depends on how much immersion they have, how why they use their languages, the many sources of input they have. Clearly, they can develop specialized vocabularies in the second language, for example, in a way that they don't have in their first language. So to give you an example, I can lecture in Italian, and I've done it, but I feel a lot more comfortable in English because I have a lot more experience in doing it in English. So Italian is my native language, but my vocabulary, the vocabulary that I need to lecture, is mostly in English.
Sure. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Antonella. And here's another one sort of related to Chile. So again, from Joaquin. So from an equity and universal access point of view, what couple of things should be taken into consideration when teaching Haitian children or families in Chile?
Sorry, when teaching, I didn't hear that.
So children or families from Haiti.
Oh, okay. Well,
often, I guess the first language will often be Creole.
Yes.
Or possibly French, and they're now in.
Yes. Yes. Well, I would say that again, these languages should be regarded as resources. I mean, they should be regarded first of all as part of obviously these children's family, culture, and so on. And so it goes without saying that they should be respected, in that way. But they should also be valued as potential cognitive resources. Again, as I said, there is no evidence that having another language creates obstacles for the learning of Spanish or whatever the community, the new community or schooling language is. And it is absolutely important that these children get enough exposure to the language of the community. And this often doesn't happen if in very closed migrant communities, there's a lot more exposure to the home languages than to the community languages. So that can be a challenge, obviously. But addressing the challenge shouldn't compromise, competence in the native languages. So it's not, as I said, it's a challenge both for teachers and for policymakers and so on. But I think, being aware of the fact that the native language is not a problem, it can be an advantage if the child is in the right conditions to learn, to hear enough and learn the community language, that is important.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we have a time for a couple more questions. So this is from Catherine, who says, it's not easy to expose children to a variety of speakers in their lessons. Regarding this topic, and apart from videos, dialogues, or intercultural exchanges, what other strategies could be used to expose children to different accents and or points of view?
That's a very good question. Thank you. Yes, I know that particularly in the typical teaching environment, it's not easy to create, a community. In families, there are ways, in preschool children, families can get organized, parents can get together and, meet at regular intervals. In a teaching environment, it's not so easy. First of all, there are, as you said, different sources of input, so videos, the internet, and so on. Clearly, these are involve passive exposure rather than interactive exposure, but it's good for children to hear, the language from these sources, even if it's passive, non-interactive exposure. For classrooms, I can tell you something that we've been experimenting with. So in Scotland, so we've been training native speakers of 3 languages: Chinese, Spanish, and French, because these are the 3 most studied languages in Scottish schools. So we train native speakers, students who are native speakers of these languages, and they go into classrooms and they do things, they do activities in their language. They are never left alone with the children. The teacher is there, but the children have the opportunity to hear the language from another person, at least, a native speaker, who speaks differently from the teacher, inevitably, because everybody speaks differently. And this is very useful and very appreciated by both teachers and students. I can give you more information about this if you would like.
Yeah, that would be great, thank you. And I think just the last question, there were a couple that came in from Patricia and Fabian. I think they're quite similar questions. So what is the best moment and way to correct oral mistakes in order to avoid frustration, but at the same time to stop fixing at the same time to stop the mistake or to fix the mistake?
This is a very interesting question that would require, a long answer, which I don't have time to give. But let me just say that, again, it depends on the age of the learner. So young children don't know what to do with corrections. Think of a very young child, a baby, or even, preschoolers. They're not really, you make a mistake, they correct them, they make the mistake again. So they really, their brain doesn't have the cognitive maturity to use that information provided in corrections. As people grow up, they become better and better at using that information. So the usefulness of explicit correction improves with age. That it has been said that there are different ways of providing feedback. So explicit correction is only one. So, okay, you shouldn't have said that, you have to say this. Right, that's very explicit and it can be missed. But there are also implicit ways of providing feedback, right? So many people in normal conversations, they might repeat what you've just said by using the wrong word or the wrong grammar, but they repeat it with the correct grammar and the correct vocabulary, but without drawing the attention on the corrections. So that's called more implicit feedback, and that is very useful both to younger learners and older learners.
Great, thank you, Antonella. Okay, well, I think the time is up. I mean, it was a great presentation. I know everyone agrees. I can see the comments, and I mean, it was absolutely fascinating. I think we could all talk to you all day. There were some really great questions also that unfortunately we didn't have time to answer. And again, thank you so much.
That any questions that you would like to ask, please send me an email.
Great.
I'll be happy to answer questions. So feel free.
Oh, well, that's a very kind offer. Thank you very much. And obviously, you are 5 hours ahead over there. So thank you very much for giving up some of your Friday evening to be with us. We really do hope that the next version of this will be in person and we can all get together and you will be able to come over here to Chile or elsewhere in the region. We do have people from across the region listening. So thank you so much again, Antonella. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye.
Thank you very much. And to the listeners, I would just remind you the next talk is by Darren Elby. So he'll be talking about English as a pillar at Colegio Costa Cordillera in Antofagasta. So please do remember that there is a separate link for that. So that will be starting, I think it's in 10 minutes. So yeah, so thank you very much everybody for joining, and yes, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye bye.